Sue O'Connell. Welcome to another edition of Lunch Hour Live. American contralto Marian Anderson was considered, quote, the voice of the century, but her talent broke down barriers around the world and was celebrated by both white and black audiences here in America. But her fame was not enough to insulate her from the trauma of racism and segregation. She was barred from performing in Constitution Hall because of her race. Anderson would go on to sing for the American people in the open on Easter Sunday in 1939 in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Behind her, the words, "All men are created equal." American Experience explores Anderson's life and this landmark moment in history in their newest film, Voice of Freedom, which airs on February 15th. We're going to take a deeper look into this film with American Experience's executive producer, Cameo George, and historian Adriane Lentz-Smith today. Welcome. But first, let's rewind to that moment that ultimately led Anderson to becoming more than just a singer, but also an activist. It's the moment she was barred from singing at Constitution Hall. Let's take a look.
In January of 1939, while Anderson was away on a concert tour, a series of events began unfolding in Washington that would pull her to the center of the fight for civil rights and change her life forever. Prior to the tour, Anderson had agreed to sing a benefit for Howard University, a bastion of black culture and activism. The trick for the administrators at Howard was finding a venue that would hold the kind of crowd Anderson was sure to draw.
This is before the Kennedy Center existed. Big venues which were intended to be concert halls for the people had not yet been built. So that in Washington, D.C., for any major performer, for a symphony orchestra, an opera company, anything of the sort, Constitution Hall was it.
Constitution Hall had been built in the late 1920s by the Daughters of the American Revolution to host their annual conventions. When the DAR wasn't using it, the 3,700-seat venue was rented to performers they considered suitably wholesome, cultured, and white. Howard University decided to test the DAR's whites-only policy, hoping that they would make an exception for the highest-paid singer in the world, the voice of the century. The rejection was both commonplace and appalling.
Possible executive producer of American Experience, Cameo George, and associate professor of history at Duke University, Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith. Welcome to both of you. Welcome to Lunch Hour Live.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I want to remind folks at home and who are watching, if you have comments or questions, just put them in the comments section and we'll bring them to the show. I was lucky enough that I knew who Marian Anderson was, although I have to say I learned so much watching this incredible documentary, and I am both horrified and embarrassed about what I didn't know. But Cameo, for folks who may not know who Marian Anderson is, tell us her story.
Marian Anderson is an unbelievably talented and inspiring contralto singer who in the 20s and 30s at one point was the highest paid singer in the entire world. She had a range that you would not believe, from deep, deep lows to crystal clear highs. And she performed through segregated America. She toured Europe incredibly successfully and became an icon in a lot of ways after this performance in 1939 at the Lincoln Memorial. But as you said, there's just so much more to her story. We're used to this one image of her in front of Lincoln, but she was amazing throughout her career. She broke the color barrier at the Met. at the Metropolitan Opera. So there are so many more things about her that I also learned through the production of this film.
Adriane, let's talk a little bit about the background of the clip that we saw, because, you know, I'm struck again by the craziness of our republic and our you know, states laws that differ, and the absurdity, obviously, and cruelty of discrimination. But, you know, at the time that Anderson, as you note in the documentary, was the highest paid singer in America and renowned internationally, she was still banned from performing in Constitution Hall. And it was really difficult for the NAACP and others to make an argument as why she should be able to perform in Constitution Hall, because of the rampant patchwork of discrimination that was everywhere. But what was the significance of her not being able to perform?
Well, it was visibly ridiculous and an insult, right? Barring this woman who Toscanini had called the voice of the century from being able to perform in the premier spot for performance in DC. It was on some level just bananas. And yet it made perfect sense to the DAR, because segregation was for them the way of things. It was a choice they made when they instituted the policy about 7 years before, but it was also kind of custom and folkway across DC and many, many other sites across the US, not simply in the South. So people who learned to live with segregation, people who embraced Jim Crow, had already set aside like the logic, right? Working through absurdity was not part of their rubric, or else there wouldn't have been a system, the kind of system of segregation that we had in the first place.
Cameo, I know there are thousands of stories, especially those of African American, of Black and Brown, of women that American Experience will be covering. Why Marian Anderson now? Why is it the time for her to get her due?
It's such a great question. I mean, for starters, there's never a bad time to do Marian Anderson, right? She's just this immense, unbelievable talent. So she's this extreme example of Black excellence. So I will always say it is always a good time to put the spotlight on her. But I think it's particularly interesting that we're doing this film now, because Marian is a real example of a woman who did not set out to be an activist or an icon. She was not hoping to be memorialized in this way, but circumstances thrust her into that position and she went for it. But I think one of the lessons that's so interesting to me in this film is that there's no one right way to be an activist. She was not out marching with a placard, but just by performing and being her talented self, she broke down a lot of barriers and changed a lot of hearts and minds, and probably in more ways than we even know, probably changed legislation and in a lot of ways. And so I just think it's very interesting that we have this example of someone who, in their own way, is taking on the system.
Yeah, I want to talk about Anderson's early life and career, because I was just so struck by how clearly obvious her talent was to every single person who she came in contact with. And through every single setback, whether it was the death of her father at an early age, the poverty, the incessant, obvious racism, the challenges of her not being classically trained, even though she wanted to be, her efforts to try and improve her craft, and racism keeping her from being able to, and being set up for failure at one point, basically, because she didn't have the access to the training that others did. She started out singing in social clubs in Philadelphia, was supported by the church community and her community to help her move forward, and then started singing at some Black churches, got some traction. But it wasn't until she got a phone call from the folks at the Victor Talking Machine that really launched her career. We're going to take a look at a clip here.
By the fall of 1923, Anderson's career seemed to be reaching a tipping point. Her concert tours were getting longer, fees were rising, and most exciting of all, she had received an invitation from the Victor Talking Machine Company. 20 years earlier, phonographs had been mere novelties. A recording might sell a few dozen copies, but that changed in 1904, when Victor recorded an Italian tenor, Enrico Caruso, singing what was called high-class music. By the early 1920s, record companies were popularizing new styles of music and targeting specific markets, including racial and ethnic groups. So the artist and repertoire department at Victor was primed when they heard of an exciting young black singer. On the 10th of December, 1923, Marian Anderson was led into a recording studio at Victor's New Jersey headquarters, where she positioned herself in front of a recording horn as the small orchestra crowded in around her. Anderson always sang a group of what were called Negro spirituals in her concerts. Arrangements by black composers of the religious songs that had given solace to their forebears. They had never before been recorded by a major American label.
What Marian Anderson did, along with Roland Hayes in the 1920s and 30s, was really popularize African American spirituals and bringing them to white audiences at a time when black women and black musicians were just so denigrated.
Adriane, I don't even know if I can begin to try and explain to someone who doesn't understand how important the talking machine was, the phonograph was. As Joe Biden almost mentioned on the campaign trail, the phonograph record. It really changed everything for everyone. But in particular, for Black artists, how did the ability for people to buy records and play these records, these phonographs on their phonograph machines in their homes, how did that impact the perception of people of color and of artistry in general?
Well, with someone like Anderson, it placed her in homes that she never would have been welcome or allowed to enter, right? There's an intimacy to hearing someone's voice, there's an intimacy to hearing someone's art, and to have that come literally into one's parlor or living room, to have Black voices, to have Black art there, when you're used to thinking of African Americans as your domestics and laborers, if at all, is to really just, kind of like the verb that keeps occurring to me is infiltrate, right? You're sort of like having people seep into, or sort of unexpected intimacy that lays a ground for something else, or it has the potential to lay the ground for other kinds of imagination or connection.
Right. And you have a reaction sometimes without knowing what you're having a reaction to, which leaves you more open, for the experience. Cameo, while you're making the film, making the documentary, here we are all in our different spots communicating over electricity through these wires across the country. And what must it be like for you to be working in these old clips of her singing and trying to go through the archives and put the puzzle pieces together, which, frankly, with a style of music which might be a challenge for a younger generation to be able to listen to and appreciate. What was that like for you?
Well, I have to say the real puzzle masters are the director, Rob Rapley, and the editor, Stephen Galladay. They're the ones who were day in, day out inundated with all of this footage and amazing material. And, one of the things that was really interesting to me is that Rob has a background in music and in classical music. And so I really think that this film, like the beauty that you hear, the way that these music tracks are layered in, the understanding that we get as viewers of the different kinds of music, which again, as you're saying, are not necessarily familiar to us now in 2020, 2021. I really think that is a credit to the production team. They really wanted to make sure that this did not feel like something from another era, something unrelatable, something sort of dusty. And I think that they did a really beautiful job of making you as a viewer have a visceral connection to the tone of her voice and to the choices that she's making musically.
Yeah, there's
actually, go ahead. I was going to say, and expanding the casual viewer's sense of what Black arts were in the 1920s and 1930s, I think there's a way that folks, when you say African American music from the jazz age or the Depression, you think of blues and jazz, and those are profoundly important. There's a reason that you think of. But that's not the only kind of music that Black folks made. And it's, I think, useful to expand our sense of what was being produced and our sense of what Black arts looked like in order to just have a better sense of the past and our inheritances.
Yeah, it's just always...
And can I just...
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I just want to add one other thing. Hopefully when all of you get to see the film, one of the things that struck me was that there was a rabid audience for classical music in the African American community at that time. And exactly what you're saying, Adriane, that was one of the things that really struck me and I really appreciated, because these are regular working people who are buying tickets to her segregated concerts. This isn't what we think of as, this rarefied class of people who are going out to see opera or classical music. This was everyday people. This was her community. These were her peers, and they supported her every step of the way with this music.
Yeah, and working not only to support her personally, but also the community across the country of folks putting these concerts together and organizing these concerts, and the rich tapestry of the African American experience throughout time that gets pushed out of history. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk and learn about it again. I want to talk too about Anderson's life as we talk about all the roads that led her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, where she ended up after being barred from performing at Constitution Hall. But as we learn in the documentary, Anderson didn't necessarily want to be known just as an activist. She wanted to be known as an artist. We're going to look at a clip now to see how her role in the 1939 concert was not one that she sought out, but performed out of duty. Let's take a look.
Anderson had come here for the sound check earlier in the day, had tried out the microphones, looked out over the empty mall. But when she was driven back for the concert, the sight of the crowd took her breath away.
I had such a feeling that I had never had before. I just couldn't say anything. And I remember that there were policemen who came to the car and escorted me to the monument. We went into a little room behind there.
She'd sung to 4,000, maybe 5,000. But this is 75,000 people. And they've been standing outside for hours.
Anderson would be surrounded on stage by 200 public figures who had signed up as co-sponsors of the event, ranging from Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black to movie star Tallulah Bankhead.
Then came the signal that we were to go out. My heart was throbbing to the point that I could scarcely hear anything.
She steps down those stairs and she lifts her head up and she begins to look out on the sea of people. The diversity in that crowd was astonishing.
It's just, I get goosebumps just looking at it. Adriane, I want to tell you a feeling I had when I was watching the film, and it was I was struck by those conservative commentators who were saying when Colin Kaepernick was kneeling, or basketball players were protesting, why don't you just shut up and dribble? And I thought, what a luxury it would be to just shut up and dribble. What a luxury it would be for Marian Anderson to just be the voice of the century, that she didn't have to have this burden of also being an activist in a way that she may not have been comfortable with. Are we ever going to get to a point where we can understand the burdens, the both visible and invisible burdens that people have when they are trying to make progress in a world that is just filled with obstacles to their progress?
Well, golly, Sue, that's quite a question. I mean, and how sad it is that my first thought is not anytime soon. Not in the way that we're going, but that's a tired thought. I will say someday we will get there, but it requires work, and it requires people being willing to do the work. And part of that is if you ask a question like, why don't you just shut up and dribble? Or why don't you just sing and nothing else? To actually listen to the answer of the question of why, right? I would think that Colin Kaepernick's answer would be, I would love to be in a position where I could just shut up and play the game, right? But I live in a world in which being a football player is not the only thing that impinges on my existence. So if people would hear that, and they would hear it as not something that's just being experienced in the present, but has been produced by a past that we also need to reckon with, then yes, we could get to a point where we are all living better lives, right? Because the other thing to keep in mind is that segregation in the past, discrimination in the present, it hampers everyone. It diminishes everyone. It reduces people's humanity to not register the suffering of others. It reduces possibility for them when they don't allow for possibility for others. And so if you want, sorry, I'm preachifying, but if you want a better world, you have to be willing to know oneself, a sort of national oneself, and be willing to do something with that knowledge, to be willing to work to know and work with what you do know.
Cameo, talk about how Anderson got to that spot of the activism. I mean, obviously, I'm hesitant because I both want to make sure I'm paying complete respect to her talent and her dedication to that. At the same time, we all live in the world we live in at the time, and there were things that were required of her. Again, a nation looks to Black women to carry us forward. How did she emotionally deal with being an activist and becoming known as an activist?
It's a really interesting question because a lot of times as we've been thinking about Marian Anderson and thinking about the unbelievable decisions that she had to make, we describe her as almost a reluctant activist. This is not a role that she sought out. She did not see herself that way. But just by virtue of having to perform over and over again in segregated spaces, just the fact that she decided to persevere, she was an activist, but there's this amazing scene in the film, and I don't want to give away all the scenes because I want people to watch it for themselves. But there's this moment that I'm always so struck by, where she is at one point performing for both a Black and white audience, but they're segregated down the middle. So white audience members on one side, Black audience members on the other side. And she walks in, and this is, again, after years and years of being told that she can only perform in certain spaces, that after performing in a space, she could only eat in her room. She couldn't go to the hotel dining room. She walks into this concert, and the way that it's described is, she nods at the white side of the audience to acknowledge their presence, and then she turns to the black side of the audience and she bows deeply. And it gives me chills to think about that, because she is acknowledging not only is she in this space, but that they're in this space, and that they came out anyway, even though they are in a lot of ways being humiliated and denigrated. Like, you can't mix with these other people in the audience, and she acknowledges it. But throughout the course of her career and her life, she made choices and broke barriers and said, okay, I will be the first. But I'm also going to make sure that I'm performing for Black audiences and supporting them in the same way that they supported me throughout all these years.
Adriane, I have another forward-looking question for you, so you're ready, you buckle up. So, I think the explosion of the opportunity for creativity, whether it's, all the streaming services that are available now, which are hungry for content, or even if it's, TikTok, the ability to tell more stories and have more people be able to tell those stories is, I think, at a time like no other, which I'm very excited about. But at the same time, I didn't know Marian Anderson's story as well as I clearly needed to and should have known. We know the stories, and we're learning more stories about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, obviously John Lewis. Are we at a precipice now where we can tell more stories about Black women and the Black women who held up and worked in the civil rights movement then and now?
I think so. I think you're right. We have more stories to tell. We have older stories to revisit and think about what we haven't told in them, right? So, complicating Martin Luther King, complicating Malcolm X, remembering that Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer are as central, if not more central, to the civil rights struggle as the sort of folks that we've mentioned. And that there are all kinds of people whose names we don't know yet, who we will. A part of that is that there is a great foundation of Black women's history. I think Black women's history is one of the most dynamic fields in U.S. history right now. There's a vigorous methodology of oral history. There's energy in getting people's papers and finding out people's stories. And that's going to be graduate students are going to have work, whether they have jobs is a different question, but they'll have work to do for decades to come on this stuff.
Cameo, what do you hope folks take away from watching this? What thoughts of or how they should think of, or you want them to consider Marian Anderson?
I really hope that people look at this story and recognize that we all have a role to play. We don't all have the same role to play, but we all have a role to play. I think coming out of the spring that we just had with people of all stripes being compelled to go out into the street and march, it was a reminder that, I don't have the voice of the century, but I do have a voice. And I think that she is a great example of that you do you. Whatever it is that you do that is excellent and special, like just by doing that, you can have an impact on the rest of us. And there's just something about that sort of collective energy and recognizing that any of our lives can be transformative and impact others, I think is really special.
And Adriane, she was a complicated and robust, and I love that documentary gives us a full 360-degree look at her. But is there any one little piece of her that you hope people learn about, maybe those that did know about her, that they come away from the documentary with?
I mean, I hope that they come away with an understanding that lives aren't moments. As you said, so many of us just know the concert at the Lincoln Memorial, and to be able to see the fullness of her matters. I also really like that she evolves, right? That the movement actually moved faster and harder and more aggressively than she did. And her willingness to go along was partially about a sense of responsibility, partially about getting caught in the momentum, and then partially about reconsidering what was necessary as times changed. And I hope that willingness to adapt and to grow and to respond is something that we all manifest ourselves in our lives.
Voice of Freedom on February 15th, of course, on PBS. Thank you both for joining me. It was great to meet you and great to chat with you. And I look forward to speaking with you both again in the future. Congratulations on work well done. I enjoyed it and learned a lot. And thanks to everybody on Facebook and YouTube for watching. We'll be back next week with the folks behind the documentary Code Switching, Race and Identity in the Suburban Schoolhouse. I'm Sue O'Connell. Stay safe.
Cool.
Thanks for watching.